Hello, welcome to the weekly show of PB&J podcast. Today we are going to speak about the topic of artificial intelligence. I am Surya Pratap Babar and joining me are Anurag Meena and Jayavardhan Lal. We'll start the discussion with Anurag Meena. He will be speaking about the historical developments and artificial intelligence in healthcare. It will be continued with me. I will be speaking about artificial intelligence in e-commerce, and then we'll hand it over to Jayavardhan, who will speak about the unintended consequences of AI. So let's start this session with Anurag Meena. Anurag, please go ahead.
Sure. So I'll quickly start off with a quick insight into the history of AI. So, like humans have always tried to leverage their own efforts and time. So, be it invention of fire, wheel, or an as easy tool as a lever. So, we have always tried to optimize and leverage our time and effort, starting from like moving from this fire wheel to mechanical tools to electricity. And the advent of electricity helped us showed us the way that how we can store data in terms of electrons or in terms of digital electronics or analog electronics. How do we store that data? And for example, the easiest or the simplest format of intelligence or computation that we developed is been a calculator. So which has augmented our analytical capabilities by leaps and bounds. This transmitting, processing, and storage of data further gave us the creativity and imagination on how we can utilize the data and these added capabilities. Like reasoning, prediction, all these things have been uh, explored by people or scientists far like as or like in computation it has been as old as 1950s 60s where machine learning, artificial intelligence, all these concepts had started garnering attention. In 1960s and 70s the actual artificial intelligence took shape and had been started the exploration had been started by researchers and scientists already by then. So it is not something that is new, which has come up in the past 5-10 years. What has changed is that at that point of time, computational capabilities were limited, and the data which was available for training such network, so training such models and all was scarce. So that is what something that has changed in the past 5 to 10 years with a lot of digitization, devices, smartphones, laptops, internets, and that has like fueled it. Like the progress that we made in the past 10, 20, 30 years has been compressed in the past 3, 4 years because of all these things happening. So, like the earlier formats of this AI and all were the expert systems, machine learning systems, or low-end systems. One of the things what AI has been focused on is, or which like where do we compare human intelligence and artificial intelligence? So, for example, computers have always been better than humans in terms of calculations, performing arithmetics, performing regression, all these kind of things. They have been faster than human beings, but they have failed to compete with human beings in trivial tasks like image processing or identifying. So, for example, identifying a face, identifying a color, identifying a shape, all these kind of trivial things, they have not really been able to compete with human beings. And that is what has been recently changing in all streams of life, be it the videos that we watch, TV that we, television programs that we see, the devices that we use, apps that we use, Netflix, healthcare, e-commerce, politics, economics. It has been in all streams of life. What I'll do is I'll start with and give you an peek into what is happening in healthcare, in specifically on lines of AI, where it is being used, what are the advantages, and how we are progressing, what the future seems like. So I'll jump into AI in healthcare. So like if we have to answer like where do we see AI in healthcare? So like it is pretty much everywhere. So it could be from right from a like if someone is tracking their diet, they're using some application to log on to log their diet. Maybe it be radiology, health insurance that we buy, triaging, like if we are visiting a healthcare hospital or a facility where we are getting like digital registrations are being done. So oncology, cardiac care, chronic conditions, uh, drug discovery or research for new drugs and all, clinical trials, all these things are where we can see there's a convergence of AI and healthcare. Like it could be as simple as the wearables that we that have become prominent these days. They are also capturing a lot of data, which is helping in the predictive diagnosis, early detection of chronic conditions and all. So just to have a look at the landscape, that actually, is it just in research papers or just in the infancy, or is it already started coming out in to the real world? And commercialization of a technology is the best way to see whether the technology has started impacting the lifestyles or the life of people. Have we actually started taking leverage of the technology that is being developed? So this is how the landscape looks like from a healthcare perspective. And if you can see, there are like right from compliance to decision support system to predictive analysis to drug discovery, there have been multiple companies. These are just a small set, and probably this is 1 2 years 2 3 years old, so it has multiplied by a manifold today. Specifically, if we talk about India, these are some of the few companies which are leveraging AI in multiple things. For example, Cure.ai is using it in radiology, identifying artifacts, identifying patterns, and there are other companies like Tricog which are using it for cardiac care, identifying anomalies or giving analyzing ECGs faster and giving the results to patients or the end users or the middle layer, like the clinic in a say a primary health center in a tier 4 place or a rural area, helping them pair up the quality gap and accessibility gap. So in a nutshell, like in healthcare, if we break it down into multiple things, where all the AI is being used is, for example, starting from well-being, our wearables that we are using, or the diet trackers, or like those things that we are using, early detection. For example, Apple Watch has started identifying or has been successful in identifying people early on in their uh, progress towards a cardiac event. So they have identified people that they would and predicted that they might go into a cardiac adverse cardiac event and alerted them beforehand. And actually, it has been proven that the alerts were indeed actual. So the people were having a deteriorating cardiac health. So early detection, diagnosis, these equipments or the devices or point of care devices, all these things are leveraging AI for quick decision making or a better accuracy, better specificity and sensitivity. Then decision support systems, which are being used by hospitals and doctors to save precious time of specialists and help and aid them in faster or identifying patterns to help them in faster decision making. And again, it is also helping in treatment, for example, helping doctors or supporting doctors in coming up with the best oncological treatment, say, for example. Then ongoing care in hospitals. When I say research, it is the drug discovery, new devices that are being made, or new big data analytics that is revealing a lot of insights and patterns into data, which is enabling new software or hardware tools. And also in training, for example, frontline healthcare workers or doctors, helping them. There have been softwares which are helping assess them, train them better with multiple scenarios, and increasing their efficacy and efficiency on field. So how is it helping if we talk about? So AI would help us in reducing the parity in quality and accessibility of healthcare. For instance, a doctor who is working in Mumbai or a tier 1 city may not necessarily, it may not make a economic sense for him to move to a tier 4 location. So there may be a flux of doctors or clinicians existing in tier 1 cities, but not as much as in tier 4 or rural areas or tier 3 areas. So what such tools can help is in bringing the pairing up that quality gap that exists in such places, and also in a lot of cases accessibility using telehealth, telemedicine, coupling it with a lot of software and connecting with the clinicians or experts in who are already there in tier 1 cities. So that is one of the areas where it can help. Faster decision making is the next thing. Like critical, can it save the doctor's time? So can it help them make a faster decision in either critical scenarios or in their day-to-day life, so that they can focus on areas where their human intelligence can actually help build more such tools and more such for more such use cases. Prediction is another thing. So specifically India has been always a country where we have always been reactive in nature. We only go to a doctor or get our test performed when there is a there are symptoms or when there is some deteriorating health. We are already reached in a phase where the health is deteriorating. We have never focused a lot on prediction, but AI can help use sensors, real world data, environmental data, wearable data to help predict any identify patterns and predict any healthcare adverse condition, and we can take an action on it faster, which can both help us in terms of health as well as economically. So one of the common questions that comes to mind is that are we heading towards a time where such technologies will replace doctor? So for that, the main answer is no. Such technologies are not to be perceived as a replacement for doctors, but rather helping them save times in repeatable tasks, mechanical tasks, or tasks where machines can give them a leverage and open up their time for research and creativity to further advance medical and healthcare. So for example, if when we a small use case that I have seen is when we go to a doctor, the healthcare file is there, the physical document, the doctor has to either arrange them chronologically, or if they are, he has to just flip to and fro to set context on what the symptoms mean or what the next phase of like the prognosis or in the diagnosis. But that is something which I don't feel is the doctor's time is well suited for. There could be software which automatically digitally arrange these for documents in a chronological fashion, in present them on his or her screen or mobile phone or a tablet in a way which helps him or which helps the clinician take a quicker decision, identify it faster, improve their efficiency per patient, and help treat a number of patients while still leaving them with the energy and efficiency for further creativity and research. The other important thing is that a software or a machine cannot replace empathy of a human being. So I don't think AI is anywhere near to replacing doctors or clinicians in reality. To take an analogy of autonomy, like what do we mean that it is not replacing a human being or cannot replace the doctor? I have taken the analogy of automated driving. So when automated driving, previously it was assumed that it is not possible. You cannot have a car drive itself. But recently companies have successfully shown that they have been able to achieve level 4 or even level 5 degree of automation where they do not require or a minimal human intervention is required, which opens up the human intelligence or time for something else. So that is something similar which might happen in healthcare. So level 5 may not be possible anytime soon or probably for a long amount of time, but level 3, 4 is still possible, where the critical things or the pattern matching where the such AI and ML is good at, traversing through lakhs of patients of data for the past 20 years, identifying those patterns in real time, presenting them and the context in real time. That is something which I think it should be taken leverage of. So what are the constraints where we are that exist in this ecosystem? So one of the foremost is conducive regulatory environment. So regulatory environment has been stringent, specifically globally, and in India it's still in nascency, but regulatory environment needs to exist with experts who know the limitations or the limitations of trials or testing of such technologies, and how to make them how to bring these technologies towards adoption, or at least for early trials, and all to at least know whether they actually can help or are of no use. So that conducive regulatory environment with experts from AI, clinical research, these people need to exist. When such people would exist, or such clear-cut regulations or environment would exist, obviously funds and all would automatically follow on when there is a clarity. The next is adoption. So again, doctors or clinicians need not see it as a replacement. It should be seen as a leverage, which is opening up their time. Of course, it would lead to certain automation and all, where certain human manpower may not be needed, but that is efficiency that we'll be moving towards, which will which is fruitful in essence to the entire society. The next constraint is data. So data has different things. So either the data availability, or if data availability is possible in some scenarios, so how do we tackle the privacy and fundamental rights of citizens whose data is being used? This data should not end up in being used in some unintended way, which probably some of them Jay would also cover later on. But how that data is being used, it should not like it I'll just move on to the concerns. So coming to that, data collection and privacy is one of the things. Then it should not lead up to create biases in terms of employers or in the society, where it could create bias, or insurances creating buckets, or depriving people of healthcare, or healthcare organizations not giving due attention to some people because of such algorithms, and their bucketing of people or cohorting of people. Then the first one, automation, I already told that there would be some manpower that would be replaced by certain automation, but overall it is the future that we should be foreseeing, and we should be prepared for. Data collection, privacy, and bias, I just told you. Yeah, so that's it from my end. I'd pass it on to Surya now.
Yeah, thank you, Anurag. Thank you for your thank you for that way you have explained how artificial intelligence can be used in healthcare. So I'll continue with my topic. So I'll be covering artificial intelligence in e-commerce. Okay. So first, let us look at how the human journey has evolved and how commerce has evolved along with the human journey. So humans first were able to think and articulate their thoughts. This brought about cognitive revolution, where natural languages were created in small groups of Homo sapiens. This idea of having a language able to communicate ensured that people stay together in one area and cultivate the land for their sustenance, which led to the agricultural revolution. Then came in the unification of humankind through systems like religion, monetary transactions, the creation of money. From there, we came about the scientific revolution. Across these revolutions, we have noticed that there is one thing in common. Humans have always depended upon each other for their sustenance and for having a participative community feeling. This was based upon transactions that are made. There were many other factors, emotive as well as material, but the transaction based approach of living in a community has always been a constant with changing nature across the human journey. Uh, Now we are at the verge of fourth industrial revolution, where the cyber systems and physical systems boundaries are being merged. Here comes in the play of artificial intelligence, robotics, Internet of Things, 3D printing, genetic engineering, quantum computing, and many other technologies. So, in our current economic system, where most of the developed and the developing world is following a free market or a capitalist type of system, we have modern capitalism on one hand, and this technological evolution on the other hand. Let's first look at the modern capitalism framework. It is mostly based upon consumerism, where the consumer has an increasing appetite for goods to consume, and increasing appetite, which brings him, and this increasing appetite brings him happiness. This is the materialistic way of life. When we have consumerism juxtaposed with fourth industrial revolution technologies, we create channels of trying to propagate capitalism through these technologies. And here comes in e-commerce. Let's first understand what is e-commerce. E-commerce is just an electronic platform of buying and selling of goods and services, where these can be transactions between a business or between a business and a consumer. So e-commerce now becomes a channel to harness the power of consumerism to keep the capitalist economy flowing. Now let us see how artificial intelligence is helping or helping e-commerce or has impacted e-commerce. First of all, whenever we want to buy something on any of the e-commerce sites that are famous, like Amazon, Flipkart, or any other retail e-commerce websites of clothing, we first have to see, what do I want to buy? If I'm buying a mobile phone, for instance, I'll have some price range in my mind. I'll have the price range, and I'll go to the particular website, compare the prices of products that I want to buy, and then make a choice. So here, AI is helping us with voice-based assistance. Those days are gone where most of the people compared products on these platforms. Today, according to Google Home, Google Home, Alexa, and Amazon's Echo are helping people shape these comparisons at the back end itself and presenting the consumer with with products which suit them, their lifestyle, and their budgetary requirements. In fact, Amazon's Echo also has a feature where it understands the user's wardrobe, body shape, which is here the machine learning has been combined with computer vision to give the user or the consumer a better guide to make his decisions. As Anurag spoke about the decision support system in healthcare, the voice-based assistance is being used as a decision support system for buying things online. And according to Quora statistics and Gartner, around 50% of the searches on the internet have been voice-enabled searches. For example, what I do is whenever I want to buy a book, I just say, "Hey Google, what is the price of in the Indian banking pandemonium book?" And the Google shows me Google's voice assistant shows me different websites where the book is available, and what are the prices and where I can buy it from, and which has the quickest delivery time. So voice-based assistance is one aspect of it. The next aspect is chatbots, right? Frequently, when we visit any website these days, we have a chat box that appears saying, "Hey, how can I help you?" So chatbots in e-commerce helps have a feature of giving a 24/7 support system to the shoppers, right? And it gives a sense of comfort. It's also a way of grievance redressal. Like if I have some issue with a product that I've purchased online, even if I mail and I don't get any reply, I always have the option of taking up my grievance on the chat box, right? So this gives a sense of satisfaction to the consumer on in one way. Now here comes in another aspect of artificial intelligence, that is natural language processing. First, let us understand what is a natural language. Natural language is a language that has been naturally evolved through human interactions across time. And natural language processing is a subfield of linguistics and computer science, where artificial intelligence is used to understand how to enable a computer to understand a natural language of humans. So whenever we are chatting with a chatbot on any of these e-commerce websites or any other websites, they are using natural language processing softwares in the back end. So this helps addressing consumer needs. It also enables the system to collect more data on a consumer and how consumer is behaving, if he has certain grievances related to a product, or if he is satisfied with his product, or if he is trying to search some product. So chatbots help in two ways. They assuage your grievances as well as help you gather data about the behavioral aspects of a consumer. Moving on, the next aspect is about creating a customer centric visual search. Now this is, I think, the most common feature of all the e-commerce websites that I have noticed. When I first started using Amazon app, on the first day it showed me what Amazon offers you, what are the products that we offer, clothing, lifestyle products, electronic products, kitchenware, books on academics, fiction, non-fiction, and multitude of other things. But as I have been using Amazon for n number of years now, the homepage has evolved over the times. Over the time, I've noticed that now the first thing that appears on my app when I open Amazon is about the books. Most of my purchases are of books related to economy or international relations, and those are the first. That is the first thing that appears on my homepage. Also, the mails that are sent to me by Amazon have the links of new books that have being released in this genre, and the author, Amazon also keeps me updated about what the author is doing these days. So this is an interesting trend that we have witnessed in e-commerce, in the e-commerce domain, and this is thanks to all artificial intelligence. So here we have to understand that here a subset of artificial intelligence called machine learning is being used. So what is machine learning? It is just a method to analyze data and build an analytical model. So what Amazon is doing in this case is that it is identifying that, okay, this person is more interested in buying books. So I've been modeled in the backend as, okay, this person likes books, prefers buying books more, prefers buying some nutraceuticals, and prefers buying some snacks online in these days of pandemic. So my suggestions are then in the same manner, and this is being done by this machine learning aspect of AI. So let us understand what is machine learning and how it is related to deep learning and artificial intelligence. So as Anurag has already told us, we can see that the evolution of artificial intelligence across time from 1950s to late till the second decade of 21st century. So we have to understand that artificial intelligence is a larger set of technology development where we are trying to make computers mimic human type of thinking. Machine learning is a subset of AI which is used mostly for data processing and then analysis for categorization. And then comes in deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning composed of algorithms that permit a software to train itself to perform tasks like speech and image recognition. I think Jayavardhan and Anurag can clarify more on this topic, that how Siri and how most of these voice-based assistants have now imbibed the use of deep learning as well in their systems. Moving on. Now, another feature of AI which helps in artificial intelligence, another feature of AI which helping in e-commerce is the targeting of potential buyers again and enhancing the sales game. So Conversica conducted a survey and found out that 37% of the market sales are affected due to poor quality of leads. So which means that the suggestions are not proper. Where in this case then comes in AI, where you always see that whenever you're looking at a particular product, on my Amazon app, I have just below it are you may also like segment, and it shows me related products. So this is how Amazon or the AI behind that system is leading you to is giving you a proper direction to buy things on this particular platform. So I just reading a McKinsey survey, and they have pointed out two cases where a European retailer was able to use AI in the backend to increase his EBIT by 1 to 2% using machine learning algorithms in fruit, and to lead the customer to the proper things that he needs. And the German e-commerce merchant Otto was able to bring in efficiency in his inventory management, as well as return times, payable times, receivable times, with the help of this backend artificial intelligence system. So the next feature is that AI is helping us, helping the e-commerce establishments to personalize the experience. So how is this helping? So if we just have a look at China's present system, even in the brick and mortar retail systems, there you can just enter a shop, your face will be identified, and you can just pick up your things, pick up the goods that you want to purchase and move out of the store. Your money will be automatically directed with account that is linked with this system. So that is a physical manifestation of personalizing the experience. The next thing is how these e-commerce websites can use AI to make a profile of a particular consumer, accrete all these different profiles together, accumulate these together, and then see how geographical distribution or demographics play a role, and then making sure that I will look at a particular set of ads which are catered to my profile as well as the geography that I am present in. There are a lot of aspects that come into personalizing the experience using artificial intelligence. So I will just speak about these just one aspect here. So now I'll speak about the challenges of having artificial intelligence in e-commerce. The first is data privacy and protection. I mean, recently we saw in November of 2020 that there was a data leak of 2 crore users of Big Basket, and their names, email IDs, contact numbers, date of births, IP addresses, locations were all shared and leaked online. And this was just available for a sum of $40,000. I mean, uh, this is a big concern in India. We do not have data protection laws. We do not have strong data localization norms. We have some that have been come in place by brought about by Minister of Electronics and Information Technology, but I don't think all the e-commerce players are on board with this policy as of now, and more needs to be done on this. Another aspect is about data storage, where India is not on the same line about data localization norms as are Japan and the European Union and US and Canada. This was seen in Osaka dialogue of G20. I think in 2019 it took place, where India took a different stand and saying that data is a sovereign entity, and we would like to have it stored inside the territory of India. Uh, so these are the aspects which pose as a challenge to e-commerce, because if there is no free flow of data, there cannot be analytics used, AI used at that same potential where to make the experience of the user better. But on the other hand, sovereign rights and sovereign issues are also a huge concern. So I think policymakers will have to figure out how this balance can be maintained here. So this was the presentation from my side, and I will ask Jayavardhan to continue with his presentation.
Thank you, Surya. Thank you, Anurag and Surya, for the presentation. And now I would like to speak about some unintended consequences of AI and how they could affect us and what can be done to resolve these consequences. So the presentation of Anurag and Surya gave us a very summarized outlook of how AI has developed, and in particular, in terms of healthcare and e-commerce, what are the applications of AI and what are the future developments and challenges of AI. And now for this section, I would like to speak about some unintended consequences of AI. So these are four spheres in which I think according to me, are most relevant to all of us. So I would like to speak about these. So first, I would like to speak about some novel innovations. So whenever we say unintended consequences, there is a negative image in our mind, but we have seen that AI has some positive unintended consequences as well. So in particular, in terms of AI used for natural language processing, which was mentioned in Surya's presentation, MIT researchers kind of tweaked a natural language processing AI, which was originally developed for understanding human natural language. And they tweaked this to study the protein sequence in viral DNA. So this was very much helpful during the COVID pandemic, wherein the researchers were able to study which particular mutation which would lead to a viral outbreak and which would not. And they were able to compare, let's say, for example, a COVID DNA with a normal influenza DNA. So this was an example of usage of AI, which was not intended for this particular DNA comparison, but the researchers of MIT made it possible. Another unintended consequences, and being a negative one, would be job losses. So we see that a lot of automation has occurred in the manufacturing industry, And with this automation, we see that the manufacturing efficiency has increased a lot. If we look in terms of data from 1990 to 2016, US had seen a 72% increase in the manufacturing industry growth. But however, we see a 30% decline in employment. It is very counterintuitive to see that the number of people in this industry are decreasing, and at the same time we are seeing an increase in output. And technological advancement through IoT and AI is one of a major factor for this counterintuitive result. The third unintended consequence of AI is a cyber risk. So on the one hand, we have companies like Amazon, Walmart, who are trying to target marketing so well that they are able to target any particular user who would be a potential buyer for their products. And they do these things through emails or notifications. And on the other hand, we have phishing emails. So people who are behind these phishing emails try to target their audience who would be the best targets for these phishing emails, and they try to make their content of their email more engaging so that it is much more possible for them to target these users. And it is also expected that quantum computing, when combined with AI, would lead to a phase wherein the current cryptographic algorithms that we use to relay sensitive information such as our credit card details or our personal information to internet, these cryptographic algorithms would be at risk, and there would be a need to develop more safer standards of cryptography. And the fourth unintended consequence, which we'll be talking about more in detail, is bias. So whenever we talk about AI, there is always a discussion of data, because AI always learns from data. And whenever we have bias seeking in this data, we have AI which has some kind of social bias associated with it. So talking about bias in AI, the root cause of this bias is human bias or unintended bias seeking into this data. And AI being a black box, specifically deep learning being a black box model, we are not able to transparently see these biases before these actually occur. So to give you an example of what happens when these biases occur, I would like to take up three very specific examples wherein people saw bias in different companies' AI models. So first I would like to talk about bias in Amazon's recruitment AI. So Amazon is one of the biggest technology companies, and it obviously has a lot of job applications, and it is not possible for Amazon's human resource department to look at every resume. So they had started developing an AI in 2014, which would sort these resumes and order them in terms of the potential of the candidate. And then when the number comes down to a manageable segment, then the human resource officials enter in, and they actually shortlist the candidate and then conduct interviews. So it was seen that the Amazon's AI had a very strong bias towards male candidates, especially in technical roles. And this strong bias towards male candidates helped further increase this data bias, as only male candidates were entered into Amazon. And this data was further used to to train this AI. So this further increased this bias. So although Amazon is said to have discontinued the use of this AI tool in 2018, we still see a very less portion of female candidates in technical roles in Amazon. So on the right, you can see the figure of Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, the percentage of male and female employees in technical roles. And you can see that female employees have always been fewer in big technological companies. And this can be attributed to an extent to the use of AI in recruitment. The second consequence of bias in AI, I would like to speak about Microsoft's chatbot. So as Surya mentioned, chatbots are technology that use natural language processing behind them, and then they are used to converse with a human as naturally as possible. So in 2016, Microsoft launched a chatbot called Tay. So the intended purpose of this chatbot was to uh, improve the Microsoft's development in conversational AI, and this has a similar technology as Microsoft's Cortana behind it, which is its flagship voice assistant, most commonly present in Microsoft's laptops. And the way Tay used Twitter tweets in learning, it turned rogue in just 5 hours after it was launched. So as you can see, there are two tweets on the right. So one is a very positive kind of tweet, and only 5 hours after that, self-learning leads to very rogue tweets from Tay, and as a consequence, Microsoft had to shut down this chatbot just after 16 hours of launch. The third bias which can which can seek into data and which has very tangible effects is regarding financial services. So all over across the globe, we have different lending institutions which are seeing a rising number of applicants for loans. And similar to recruitment AI, a method to automate this process of rating users and their probability of returning back the loans is utilization of AI. So AI is used to quantize the customer profile, and it gives every borrower or every applicant a score, and this score is utilized to first of all decide whether to give this person a loan or not. And if the bank is giving this person a loan, it is also utilized to fix the interest rate for that particular person. So people with very good credit scores are given loans at less interest rate because they are more likely to return these loans. And the opposite is true for people who have a history of defaulting. So over time, we have always seen, particularly in the US, the denial rates for Blacks and Hispanics has been higher historically. And this has still been the case even when AI services are used by most of the major banks. And for whites and Asian, this denial rate is less, as you can see on the figure on the right. And the same is true for interest rate as well. Blacks and Hispanics have a higher interest rate associated with their loans as compared to whites and Asians in the US. So talking about how we can focus on building unbiased AI. So these are three things that I believe are very important. There can be other things as well, but according to me, these three are the major things to do. So anticipating bias is the first step for an organization to uh, kind of acknowledging that bias does exist in every AI. So when organizations acknowledge that this bias is going to occur, there is a responsibility for the organization to create KPIs, key performance index, that would be able to quantize this social bias over time. So companies can look at these KPIs to get to know whether their AI is actually unbiased or it is turning biased. Because any AI at the time of launching can be unbiased, but due to increased training and increased utilization of data, it can turn bias at some point of time. So it is very important for companies to actually monitor the unbiasedness of their AIs. The second suggestion would be AI audits. So countries specifically in the Europe have very strict laws regarding AI and data. And we do not see such stricter laws in India right now. But AI audits through independent organizations are very important in this field going further, because this would help this would help in establishing industry benchmarks and best practices as well in different industries. And the third major uh, responsibility for companies would be diversifying their teams that build the AIs. So it is very much possible to see AIs that have biases associated with the people who are building them. So it is advisable to have a team which has a very diverse background, has had diverse opinions, which could not only identify these biases during the development of AI, but also help them nullify these biases, because there would always be different opinions present, and as such different utilization of data and different fine tuning of AIs. So yes, this is from my side, and now I would like to move to the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayavardhan. That really put things into perspective about how there can be some negative and positive consequences to artificial intelligence. So we'll have a Q&A session now, where we will discuss the topics presented by each of the presenter, and we'll have a general discussion also around how AI is impacting us in our day-to-day lives, and what can be the future if it is not paid, where if no attention is paid to how the regulatory framework is developed around artificial intelligence. Okay, so let's start with the discussion around Anurag's topic of AI in healthcare. So I have a few discussion points on this, so I'll start with that. So Anurag, we are in a pandemic, and in India we are undergoing a lockdown, and vaccine is the only thing that is going to help us, right? So how can AI or fourth industrial revolution technologies be used in vaccine development as of now? What do you think?
So I think one of the things, like what Jay had mentioned as well, that AI has been used for identifying strains that are possibly infecting, as like again AI ML has also been used for identifying protein folding structure and all statistics around that. So one of the use cases of AI has been drug development, or to a certain extension towards in vaccine industry, towards identifying and predicting and statistically identifying whether something may work, or at least filtering it out from 100 choices or 1,000 choices. Can we bring that down to 50 candidates that need to be tried, and what could be adverse reactions or those kind of things beforehand from the existing databases, where we know existing chemicals or RNA or DNA strands, how they have reacted, how they have interacted, how mutations have occurred, those kind of things. It can help in those aspects in accelerating, or apparently has been helping in accelerating the vaccine development and R&D at a lot of places.
Okay, so as of now, AI can be used for the analytical part in post-vaccine stage, right? But what about the stage where vaccine formulation,
Yeah, so
formulation to development?
Yeah, so what I have been talking about is at the time of development only, that you can already have, say, 50 candidates, and you already can run models which can predict from past interaction data and all how they will interact with the live tissue and all, and help you filter them out, or at least reject a lot of candidates and just move forward with the possible candidates before even going towards trials and all. So even the try and during trial, again, finding out patterns and what are the kind of patterns that are emerging out, those are places then where it can be used. The third is cohorting of people who are actually at the need of at the highest need of vaccines and all, and identifying the distribution and all, how to optimize it. These are the three phases where AI or machine learning can be of use.
Okay, thank you. I got it now. My next question is sort of a question relating to ethicality around AI in healthcare. One of the major aspects of healthcare service in a human to human form is about having the patient's consensus to a particular treatment, right? In the age of telemedicine, if like we have WebMD, where we go and search and it suggests some random things that we have a particular disease which we haven't even heard of. But what about the patient's approval in treatments? If I have a cyber physical system which is acting by in its own capacity, and I, as a patient, am not able to give my consensus, say because I'm in a coma or I'm unconscious. What is the ethics around that then? How should AI or algorithms be developed for those situations?
So, for example, like what you told, WebMD, if you go to, you end up with something you actually haven't heard about, or nobody nearby you has heard about. So, the Google or WebMD, these systems are, they'll answer what you have asked, they'll not answer what you need. So, the question or the what your search query has just a limited context. So it does not, you do not necessarily tell them what is the gender, what are the comorbidities, what is the medication that you are already on, what is your current vital stage. Those kind of things are not given. So just a single query helps you, or they are just using a single keyword to come to the conclusion. But having said it, there are certain conversational AI which you answer a few questions and they automatically start triaging and asking you the relevant question. Do you have this symptom? And then eliminating the conditions and identifying what may be the possible cause. So these are used as both for triaging before when the patient is booking or is getting admitted, or their first registration at the hospital is done, or when you are visiting the hospital, you are pre-booking your appointment slot. They could also be used as decision support system for clinicians to identify it quickly without putting in a lot of mental effort, because a lot of things are like sequential and a follow-up questions that are sort of trivial. So that is one of the aspects on the search part. What was the like? For example, we also at Neodocs have been building something similar to help you understand your healthcare data. Coincidentally, so what was the second part of the question?
My second part of the question is, what about patient's approval?
So
If I'm in a like I'm not in a state to give my approval, will the should an AI algorithm be framed in such a way that it reaches out to my first family or my guardians to seek approval,
so
as doctors do now?
yeah, so one is that what should be the flow of the approval. So if the person is not in a condition to take it, so the guardian or a friend or the next kin should be asked. And the other is what the proposal from a clinical perspective, prognosis or diagnosis there, is it correct, and the treatment, whether what is the reliability of that. So again, from a layman or a non-clinical perspective, it is very difficult. So if a doctor is prescribing a surgery to someone, it is very difficult to just Google it and come to the same conclusion, or negating it. It is not possible. So again, they are the experts, and uh, assuming that most of the time it is they're acting in the patient's interest, and not in self-interest or any with a self-intent or a motive, but most of the time it is in the patient's interest. It The other thing is it a correct decision or not? So human mistakes or human biases do happen, where sometimes the decisions are not correct, but they are again, the human intelligence is limited to their experience, or what are the type of cases, or how they have been solving, or what is the approach towards solving that problem, or identifying what is the best course of action for the patient at that given point of time. The second is the flow thing. So that is actually possible, and in fact, most of the places in the Western countries like Europe, US, they all like. In fact, even in India, the risk forms and all those things you have to sign. The liabilities and all are supposed to be signed by the next of kin or the guardian, or depending on the patient's condition and the age.
Uh, Again, this brings us to an interesting point. Anurag, you said that most of the decisions that are made by doctors are in the best interest of the patient. In case of there we have accountability fixation, right? Even if the decision is right or wrong, if it's right, we praise the doctor. If it's wrong, uh, we have the doctor to be held accountable for. In case of AI, then will the AI, the company who has built that decision making system, be held accountable in that case? What do you think? Or
So
should
for example,
accountability framework be around this kind of a thing then?
So even like in the case of doctor being accountable, one of the actual fact is that medical negligence is very difficult to prove. It has to be a gross blatant mistake, else medical negligence is very difficult to prove, because it is not very trivial. Like the doctor is taking on the like in the moment decisions and all, which not necessarily, again, there's always wisdom in hindsight. After a result has happened, we can always blame that whether it was right or wrong, but the doctor's mindset, you cannot, like, he's seeing 10 patients, the patient is serious, he's having a lot of those mental mathematics going on, which is going on to that decision making. At the same time, like, so again, so that is that it is very difficult in even in that case to blame the doctor if something gross has happened, that it was a doctor's mistake or the decision was not right. Same goes for the algorithm. It is just that our psychologically we have put a person behind the driver's seat, and here there is no one who is driving the decision making. So accountability and all, I feel the best way would be like in the West, where if something goes wrong, there are insurances and insurance companies which are like taking some of the hedge against, and they are then becoming responsible for maintaining that accountability, because they are at a loss if there is something bad happens. And that has been one of the propellant in improving the quality of care. And so those kind of infrastructure actually helps the entire ecosystem. It inflates the cost a bit, but it drives the innovation a lot faster. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, okay. It doesn't answer my question, and thank you, Anurag. Jayavardhan, would you like to now, first of all,
Sure.
pitch in to my questions, and second, you can ask your queries
Sure.
about.
Regarding the last question of the ethical issues around AI in healthcare, so I would like to mention that taking analogy from self-driving cars. So in principle, in theory, if self-driving cars are implemented globally, or even in a particular geography, most of the cars are self-driving cars. In theory, it will bring down the accident rates quite a lot. There would be a requirement of narrower lanes, which would give more space of building infrastructure around cities. So in theory, it is true, but it all depends around that one extreme case of if an AI has to decide between hitting a car or hitting a pedestrian. So what will it choose? So this ethical issue is being around, I think, around self-driving cars or any AI which has a very important decision to take. And I think that benchmarking it with current systems would be something to, first of all, bring trust around that AI. So according to me, I think having a level 3 or level 4 automation system wherein decisions from a black box AI are interpreted by a doctor and then conveyed to the patients would be something that could have more trust and at the same time could have more accuracy. And then benchmarking this system with a system wherein no black box model is used and just a human inference or human skills are used, benchmarking it with a system, conventional system, would give us a clear idea of whether we have improvements in term of accuracy or improvements in term of decision making time. And then we can, I think about the ethical issues around this. So what do you guys think about this?
Anurag, go ahead.
So I think like there was a very popular question on similar lines, whether a driverless car would hit a tree or a pedestrian. That there's a choice to be made at a. It was a very popular question on a very popular AI forum. I do not recall the name, but there's a old age man and a child. And a child in teens, which is there on the two sides of the road, and there is something has happened, and the car has to take a decision whether it hits the child or whether it hits the old person. So there was a like very differing opinion, even due to cultural differences, where in certain cultures a old age person's life is more valuable versus a child. Certain cultures where a child is preferred towards an old age man. So again, a lot of these decision makings and all, I think removing human bias is, like, having said, is very easy comparing it with a non-black box model. But does that non-black box model have a lot of cognitive human biases as well? And also again the cultural thing that comes into play.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes,
In
I
fact,
agree with your point. Yeah.
in fact, if we look at the most common ethical trolley problem question, whether you will where you have a trolley going on a track and you have to choose a path where you will be killing one person or five people, right? I mean, this is somewhat similar to that problem. You're just replacing the one person and five people by a older person and a younger child. And in most of these cases, like the way Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who gave us the intrinsic morality, he said that harming any kind of life is immoral or unethical, right? So, but there, prior to AI, in real human life, there was a decision being made by the person, right? So again, I think it brings me back to the same issue of accountability fixation. If say Tesla's automated car hits chooses to hit a older person, will the next of the kin of the older person be able should sue Tesla, or should the family of that older person sue the person who's owning the car? I mean, this is up for discussion, and people watching this uh, on various on our YouTube channel can comment their opinion in the comment section. Uh, so that was all about that was those were the questions from my side about AI in healthcare. Jayavardhan, do you have any other questions to ask?
Yes, I do have an additional question. So we see a lot of emerging startups, specifically in the Indian landscape. So how do you think the Indian landscape compares to the global landscape? And related to this question, I also wanted to ask that whenever there is a new business model innovation in some say Western countries such as the Europe and US, it is a lot of times fine-tuned for a particular geography such as India or China or Japan, and then implemented as a different startup in that particular country, such as we have Ola, which is very similar to Uber. We have Flipkart, which is very similar to Amazon, but it is very much tailored to the Indian geography. So what do you think is the landscape? How does the Indian landscape compare to the global landscape, and how possible is it to implement such a black box kind of technology in different geographies in a certain limited time frame? So do you have something on that, Anurag?
So yeah, so one is that to answer your first question, what is the landscape and how does it specifically look like in India? So one of the biggest differentiator in healthcare in India is that we are a out of pocket driven expense country where insurance penetration is still very low, even in metros and all. It is relatively high compared to tier 2, tier 3 and rural, but it is still very low for a country like India. And so that is one of the reasons where the dynamics change a bit. So in the initial phases of development and all, a lot of funds, data, those kind of things are required for the development, and you have to traverse the road very carefully, because again the data digitization has not been, for some similar reasons that insurance was not there in the West or in developed countries. Insurance has driven digitization to make their processes faster, efficient and transparent. In India, that digitization hasn't yet kicked in. It is in the under the hood with the digital health mission, national digital health mission, and different policies which are aiming towards digitizing that. So that will help on the front where the data access and those kind of things for research, R&D, and developing new products that direction may open up for startups. The second is the cost. So if it is an out of pocket expense driven country, then you have to be wary that the company operating in a US or Japan or Europe kind of geography may not necessarily be able to survive with the same economic model in India. So that is where one of the biggest difference arises, that we have to have a business model innovation in terms of you can have volumes, but again, achieving those volumes is a distribution, marketing, and strategy comes in play. And the business model around costing has to be India specific to cater the target audience. Yeah, and this was your question, right?
Yes, Anurag, thank you. That was very clear.
Okay. Yeah, in mute.
So we can now move on to having a discussion on AI in e-commerce. So we have discussed AI in healthcare. Now let's go on to discuss AI in e-commerce. So do you guys have any questions on that?
So I have a few questions. So, like, if AI, I understand that it is helping me make a better decision or a faster decision, but where is the line that is being, like, is there a line being drawn that I am nudged to buy something which is actually not, I would have not bought it if that AI or that specific nudge on that specific, if I may say, that weak movement is there, that there is a nudge, there is that targeted marketing that happened at that sweet spot of time where I made an impulsive purchase. So is there a line being drawn where I'm just increasing a sale?
Okay. So is there a line between nudging me to buy something that I don't want? That is your question essentially. And I agree that ethically this should not happen. But and if we look at e-commerce from the consumerism point of view, where the capitalist economy works on greater consumption as we go along for the economy to grow, we always speak about, let's look at it from a macro perspective first. We always are interested in the GDP growth rate. We consider India to be growing slowly if it's growing at 4.5%. Similarly, if we take narrow down this analogy at an individual firm's level, they want their sales to increase, right? And from their perspective, they are just marketing their product. They are trying to move their inventory as quick as possible. They are trying to make profits for their shareholders. They are trying to make sure that their employees get paid. And how will this happen for them? This will happen for them by making sure that most of the products that are available on their platforms are sold. Uh, and one more thing, if a AI or an e-commerce site is nudging me to buy something that I don't want and is showing a lot of ads or suggestions that you may also like this, you should buy this, then I think from an individual point of view, my point of view, I would move on to the next e-commerce platform, because there is not a dearth of these platforms. So I think that is my point of view on this one.
So just to add to it, like, is anyone also looking at the environmental cost that this is adding? So for example, I bought 10 different things, I needed just 7 of them, so those 3 are actually an unnecessary environmental impact that I have caused. No matter, that would have increased the top line of the company, would have rewarded the employees and all, would have increased the consumption, but that consumption is also coming at a cost.
Yeah, this is a very good question. Now, in the Indian context, we have an environmental impact assessment framework, and this framework is for individual companies and individual projects that the company is doing. For instance, if Amazon is building a large warehouse uh, uh, in any kind of a location, even if it's eco-sensitive or not, if it is of certain degree of magnitude, and if the project is making sure of investing a certain amount of money, then they have to go through the EIA process. And uh, about having the EIA norms for e-commerce firms, I don't think that's a good option, because uh, the e-commerce firms are the future, right? I mean, the products that we are using ultimately cause harm to the environment. Say, if I'm buying 3 mobile phones in a duration of 5 years uh, from e-commerce platforms, and I'm not making sure that I'm disposing them right. If after my use, if I just chuck it in a garbage bin, surely there'll be lithium leakage, there'll be lead leakage, plastic pollution, and that is ultimately going to cause harm to the environment. So I think uh, at present it's best to stick to this policy of having EIA for particular products and the firms that are making it, rather than having a environmental impact assessment for the e-commerce websites. I mean, if we look at it, they are just intermediaries, right? So that is my point of view on this one, Anurag.
Okay, I think that answers my question.
Okay, Anurag.
Surya, I would also like to ask a question. So, a lot of times we have these big players in specific geographies. For example, we have Amazon in the US. We have, I think, close to Amazon, we have the second biggest player is Flipkart. So, not only e-commerce, but they have a lot of user data as well, right? So, if they have my buying history, they can try to closely profile me. For example, if I'm buying more of masks during COVID or more of sanitizers, I might be a person who is more prone to allergies or dusts, and they might and this data might not be that useful for Amazon or Flipkart, but that might be useful for other companies, such as a company that might be selling air purifier. So reselling of this data and consumer profile, so how ethical do you think that is? And because there is obviously a question of anonymity over there as well. So what are your opinion on this? Because the example I gave is a very trivial example where it does not harm me in any way, even if my data is being sold. But what if this reselling of data is harming my anonymity? So what do you have for that?
You're right. So your question pertains to your data protection,
Mhm.
the flow of your data, and the storage of your data, right? So let's look at it from this perspective, right? Because say if you're, as you said, that if you're buying certain healthcare products constantly during this pandemic time, so and Amazon has your data. Let's say you're buying it from Amazon. So Amazon has your data and has profiled you in some way. On you are also you might have also registered in a very good hospital which has a good patient management database, which has your electronic health records. Now the question of this thing, this case which you pointed out, comes where that your electronic health record and your purchases are being compiled and then analyzed. Then it's a problem for you, right? And that's where data protection and data flow and data storage comes in. So in the Indian context right now, uh, government of India is very much adamant on making so okay, first there was BN Sri Krishna committee that was formed I think in 2018, which has categorized types of data of an individual. There is something called core data of an individual, which pertains to your health, uh, your physiology, your health, your physiology, your finances, and some most of your personal intimate details, some of your pictures, family pictures, or your partner's pictures that are on your electronic devices or in your electronic storage, right? So and there are some other categories, and as you go down the categories, the protection, the BN Sri Krishna committee says that the protection of the data should then come down. So the core data, India is right now insisting that the core data should always be stored in India, and there should be a, a an agreement or an approval from the data principal. Now you who is generating the data, you are the data principal here, and the platform that is going to use your data is called the data fiduciary. So BN Sri Krishna committee has recommended that the data fiduciary should always take the permission of the data principal whenever it's accessing their core data. Uh, so from that point of view, we have to have a policy framework which ensures that the core data is never harmed and it is taken in a generalized way and not in a particular individual's identity. I mean, if I am a healthcare, if I'm in a healthcare service provision business, uh, I should be able to access your data as okay, this is an individual who is buying a lot of healthcare products recently, but I should not have your name, your identity, your social identity numbers like Aadhaar card number or your PAN card details, which will help me track you on different kind of websites through your KYC directly, right? So I think this kind of a policy framework, which where consumer is able to give his approval for data uses or not, should be in place. Also, recently there has been a startup in the UK which is paying the data, which is paying the data principal for uses of his personal data. So that can also be a very good option. There has been this startup in London. I forget its name. It was presented in a startup pitch competition in the UK recently. Our viewers can have a look at and Google it, and if Anurag has the time, he can also look what is the name of this particular startup. So I think there should be this kind of a framework which should be in place. Jayavardhan, does that answer your question?
Sure, Surya. And also, I also had one more question. So let's say, for example, I'm using different e-commerce platforms or different platforms on the net in general. So let's say use a healthcare startup. I use Amazon. I use different. Let's say I use 10 of these platforms, and 9 of these platforms have very strict regulations regarding my data. So they have my personal information that is protected very strictly, and they have my non-personal information, as you call it. So that is not protected that strictly, but can be resell to different, let's say, buyers of the data. And there is one of the companies through which I interact, and that has lenient laws regarding this. Let's say there is a data breach in that one company, and through this data breach, using my non-personal information, someone is able to link my personal identity to the data of these 9 different companies. So did you get what I'm saying? So my concern is that if there is a data breach at some company and people are able to link my non-personal data at different companies which were maintaining it very strictly. So who is at fault over here? So obviously the company who is protecting these data leniently is at fault, but at the end the customer is affected, right? So what do you think should be a framework around this? So should there be very regulations around audits of these data, or should there be regulations around actually having a government interfere when the companies are setting up data centers or data company level data privacy regulations in India? So what do you have on that?
So you're absolutely right. This is a very real possibility according to me. Let's say that these 10 different companies that you spoke about are located in 10 different geographies. One is in India, one is in Ireland, one is in, say, USA, one is in Japan. And if, say, a firm in Ireland uses this non-lenient clause, and there is easy access to your personal data, which is of non-core category, and then they are able to extrapolate who you are in those other 10 companies and your data there, right? Correct. So I think in this case, what is of the most important, the most important thing that can be done to make sure this doesn't happen is that we need a global data regime for this. US has this GDPR thing, right? The data protection regime in place. Japan is fighting for making sure that there is something called Osaka track, where there is free flow of data. India is of this say that no, data should be stored and localized in the territory that it is being generated in. So right now there is this debate and there is no solution in sight. Once we have a common data policy across all the countries, sponsored by an international institution like the UN, the United Nations, then I think when this problem arises that certain firm leaks your non-core personal data, and then they're able to track you to the track your data in other companies, then if we have a common policy, then we have a way of investigating into this collectively and making sure that that company is held responsible for it, because then it comes under an entire gamut of framework that is being created globally. I think that is the way ahead for this, Jayavardhan. Unless we have a common policy, we cannot have common solutions to it, right? The same thing can happen to a person sitting in Africa, South Africa, or any other country, a least developed country, say, a least developed country who has nothing much to offer and is completely reliant on the state for his protection. If the state is part of this global policy of data protection, then he can have a quicker grievance redressal compared to a regime where everyone is looking out for their own data protection system, like India, Japan, and US are doing right now?
Correct. Yes, I think that answers my question. And the fact that there is globalization and different companies are utilized in different geographies, I think having a global regulatory body would make much more sense in that context. Yes.
True. Okay.
But
Any-
there's a company to add to it named LexisNexis, which is a global company, and it to a certain extent does typically that only. It triages without the actual name and all, but it is very good at triaging a person out from a pool of data. It works across healthcare, finance, and offers these services to other people, the other companies.
Okay, Anurag, thank you. And I think the startup that I was talking about was this Digi.me. So people can look that up if they want to sell their data, but I don't think that will be valid in India, and don't do it. That is my opinion. It's never good to share your personal data publicly. Okay, so any other queries regarding AI in e-commerce?
No, that I don't have.
I think that's it from my side.
Okay. So let's move on to the discussion around AI in unintended consequences of artificial intelligence. And I would like to ask I have some queries or some discussion points around it, Jayavardhan. So Jayavardhan, you spoke about that there can be a lot of job losses, which is unintended consequence of AI. Recently, I read a snippet of a World Economic Forum which says that the fourth industrial technologies, your AI, IoT, robotics, automation, and the entire gamut of that can lead to a decrease in overall employment across the globe of 150 million jobs. But at the same time, it can create around 250 to 300 million new jobs, which need a greater skill level, because the people who want these jobs will need to have a certain understanding of these kind of technologies. So then comes in the aspect of skilling. How should say firms or policymakers go about ensuring that there is skilling for this next step that we are going to take?
Sure. So yes, I think that the point of job losses is very much connected to job creation as well. So whenever we talk about AI, we see that a lot of tasks that were previously automated, for example, standing on a production line 24 hours a day and doing the same repetitive work. So this is something that can be done very easily using robotic arms. So having robotic arms in place would give these workers to spend their time on jobs that are not that exhausting, or at times spend their time on jobs that are more creative and that have more impact. So reskilling themselves to jobs that are not very different from their current jobs, but help them in developing skills that are related to, let's say, manufacturing, but not implementing manufacturing, but let's say supervising the AI algorithms. So that can be something that can be done for a worker who was working on the manufacturing line. And I think that this is something similar that can be true for different jobs, such as a driver who might have lost a job due to self-automation, driving automation. So he can be put in a job that is related to driving, but utilizes more creative skills or less exhaustive hours of work. So reskilling people in their own domain, but in skills that are demand more creation or are something that AI cannot do. Let's say, for example, creative thinking or strategic decision making. So these are something that AI cannot do right now. So reskilling people in those skills would have much more job creations in this new aspect, which could have even larger impact on the GDP. So we can have GDP growth taking place even if we have loss of jobs in a particular sector. So I think that's what I think.
Okay, so keeping the domain of work same, but upskilling to make sure that they are able to interact in this new AI environment, right?
Correct.
It does sound logical. You look at a scenario of say China, where they have an aging population, and the economy and the society is moving from a manufacturing based to services based economy.
Mhm.
In that case, let's like the major point that I'm making here is that the age of the employee, right?
Mhm.
A younger employee is able to upskill him uh, quickly. There might be some hesitancy in the older age employees. So then,
Mhm.
how should we go about it? I mean, should the state bring
Mhm.
in? Anurag, you can also pitch in for on this. Like, should there be something of a universal basic income to provide support to those who are not able to cope up, or should reskilling the older employees also be an option? Because this is a question that has been put up in a lot of debates on global AI and its impact on jobs. So what do you guys
Mhm.
think? Taking the case of China in particular, because it's the manufacturing hub of the world right now.
Mhm. So one of the things that I particularly have in mind is, let's say, an older person obviously has more experience of work. So his inputs on, let's say, supervised learning of an AI model would be of more importance than someone who has, let's say, a couple of years of work. So making space for people based on their age, based on their experience, would be something that can be very interesting. Let's say, for example, we have implementation level of AI, and then we have training skills of AI. So people who have more experience can uh, contribute more towards regulating the data, and uh, checking the sanity of the data, and providing data that can be actually useful for faster training of an algorithm. So this is something particularly seen in Japan. So Japan has a large manufacturing presence in the world, and Hitachi in particularly is doing stuff around robotic arms, and that particularly requires people who were originally doing these conventional work. So training these robotic arms require experience of such people, and so these people are in fact very aged people who are contributing towards robotic arms. For example, let's say for welding, in particular robotics arm for assembling different units of a car. So yes, people are contributing in their capacity, I think. What do you think about this, Anurag?
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that. That the old age population has gained a lot out of their experience, which is still very useful for training these future AI models and across industries, not just limited to one industry. For the universal income thing, I think it has been in discussion for quite some time now. Like, would it cause a loss in income tax and all if as income taxes that are generated as revenues by the government, if a lot of things are taken over by AI? But I feel that time is still a bit far, where say a huge chunk of our GDP is getting involvement from AI, which is causing a significant loss in the income tax or the revenue generation. And but at the same time, this efficiency without the usage of these humans, which can run 24/7, would be generating extra incomes, which could be like that automation or the AI itself could be brought under a tax regime where a small percentage extra goes in, and that is being utilized for the welfare of the other people. If you look at it from a welfare state perspective, from a capitalist perspective, the efficiency is because the business has invested so much, and that is why it is reaping the benefits. And again, unless it is taxed by the government and it is made compulsory, uh, the company or the firm may not really deem it necessary to be given back to someone else. It is their efficiency and investment that is paying.
And also, to add on to this, I think that uh, if we have certain loss of jobs in the older section of the population, I think in initial phases, there should be some framework to support these people in reskilling. But if we look at a longer time frame, I think that the generations to come would originally know the importance of having these new skills, and I think we will see a workforce that has a different set of skills that are required in the AI era. So yes, in the initial phase, I think that there might be some assistance of state required, but at the cost of this assistance, I think in the newer generations, we would see people who have very specific and creative skills that could help in the AI era.
I agree with Jayavardhan and Anurag's point. So putting things into perspective, we should be making use of the experience gained by the elder employees and help them reskill and support them financially during this phase of transition. And as Jayavardhan pointed out, that the newer generation of workforce that comes in should be coming in with these skills. So which also needs a education reform in a country like India, where many of our established CEOs have said that what is being taught in college is really not relevant to what the industry or the market needs. So that's a very good point. And also, Anurag pointed out that there might be some loss of revenue, state revenue in form of income tax. But then I think if there is a fall in income tax, Anurag, then there can be a case of increase in corporation tax, because if firms are getting more efficiency, they'll have more revenue, more profits. So I think the corporation tax and the indirect taxes will have that cushioning effect for the fall of income tax. But fall of income tax will also mean that the incomes of people have really gone down compared, like for a population like India, where we are generating so like meager amount of jobs, and the workforce that is being added is around 1.5 crore every year. I mean, this is really something to think about. And I hope that we have a policymaker someday on this podcast from Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology who can shed some light on this, what is being done and what should be done, and someone from Niti Aayog if possible. So moving on to my next question for Jayavardhan. Jayavardhan, you pointed out about the gender disparity or the gender bias that has come in some of the AIs. I would just make a complimentary point here to what you have presented. In our earlier discussion, we saw how inequality is being propagated by the pandemic. So if we just put things in the macro picture here, we can have gender disparity due to AI. There is post-pandemic increasing gap, and according to World Economic Forum's global gender inequality report, there's women in the same job profiles earn around 27% less than the men. So if I think if AI comes in, then will it exacerbate this inequality, or how will we make sure that this inequality is not widened when AI comes in operations in the firms? Jayavardhan.
Sure. So as you mentioned that these inequalities in different sectors, different spaces of our social and cultural life, I think that AI is one of the factors, and there are many factors to come. But I think that from a technological perspective, from a perspective of a technology company who is building AI and who is utilizing AI in, let's say, job recruitment, minimizing the effect of AI in this increasing disparity should be something that should be focused on, because we do not want AI to worsen the effect, that is worsen the current situation. So making sure that AI is actually impartial is something very important. And for that, I think companies should be able to first measure if their AIs are impartial or not. So bringing AI to the picture does not always increase this racial disparity, but I think that it is on the company to actually make sure that their AIs are impartial. And even if in countries where there are not strict laws on this, I think companies should take the responsibility to make sure that their ways of operating are more ethical, more impartial. And in the US, we have seen, for example, banks such as Capital One, who are more open to sharing data, more open to debating on their AIs used for lending. So I think that having this kind of attitude wherein companies are picturing themselves as more accountable would definitely make a situation which would definitely create a situation in which AI in itself would not be responsible completely for this disparity. There might be other issues that we will still have to answer, but yes, this is my response for this.
Okay, I think that answers my question. So we have to make sure that the person who's framing the algorithm is unbiased, right? And that is a very important thing to have. And from that, we can conclude that the recruitment of such technology firms should also have an ethical component in it, where people are or not only the quantitative aptitude, but some of a emotional quotient or emotional intelligence and ethical aptitude is of a person who's trying to gain employment in that firm is also checked. I think
Correct.
that can be a possibility, but then how will this be checked is also a question to be discussed. And viewers can comment how this can be done in the comment section. Moving on to my next question for Jayavardhan. You presented the example of the Tay, right? The tweet bot made by Microsoft. So if it is learning from the data that is generated on the internet, can we have a filtration of data for it to access, a system where the data is filtered for it to access? We as humans have liberty, so we have right to information, right? But AI does not have liberty. It does not then have the right to information. Uh, but then there is a bias in the algorithm framer here. If the algorithm framer is liberal, he will filter out the conservative elements of data points that are generated on the web. If he's a conservative, he'll filter out the liberal points that are made on the web. So what is the solution then? I mean, this is a question that has bugged me. Both of you can pitch in, starting with Evan.
I think regarding the chatbot, Microsoft Tay, I think there are two levels to the problem. So first is the motivation of the company was not to create a bot that generates hate speech, right? Obviously, Microsoft does not want to create a chatbot that does not talk nicely to people or creates racial remarks. So the motivation of the company was to create a chatbot that has a conversational element as close as possible to the human conversation. So if we look at the task in this sense, obviously humans do not have positive emotions all the time. If you say something bad to a person, he will respond with some disgust or some defensive remarks. So filtering out all the negative conversations would create an AI that has only positive remarks or positive sentiments, but at the same time that would not be that conversation. Even if you say racial comments towards this AI, it will behave very positively towards you, which it should not. So this is one way of thinking about the problem. And the second way, even if we build an AI that only trains from positive sentiments or positive remarks, there has to be an AI in between which decides which, as you mentioned, filtering out is also a process in which bias might enter. So then having an AI which filters out the training data and actually identifies which data is positive and which is negative would also require to make sure, which would require us to make sure whether that AI itself is neutral or not. So looking at the problem from Microsoft side, it should build a system that has both positive and negative sentiments, but not only it should make it a point that it does not completely focuses on the negative sentiment or the negative conversation, but at the same time there should be some mechanism to filter out extreme negativism and extreme negative sentiments. Yes, I think this would be my response to this.
Okay, I think that answers my question. So we have to have some kind of a filtration system, or the AI should be able to filter it by himself or herself. I don't know what the proper pronoun for AI is. So okay, so those were my queries regarding decision points regarding unintended consequences. Anurag?
So I don't have any additional questions. Some of the questions you already asked.
Sure.
Okay, so I'd like to add one more point. This is a general point which most of our discussions had in common. That is the degree of autonomy that should be given to AI. Okay, let's see. I think, in my opinion, the future is cyber physical systems where AI is helping the experience of the user or to be better. Even if we take the case of Neuralink that is being developed by Musk, it's a chip being implanted in your brain, which is helping you interface with a digital medium quicker. In that case, what should be the degree of autonomy that should be given to artificial intelligence? and where should it seek human intervention or human permission? If something is implanted in my brain, I don't want it to make me think in a certain way. I don't want myself to lose my autonomy because of an external element. So what do you guys think about that?
The human or you should be in the pilot seat and initiating the communication, like what you want to access or what you want. It shouldn't be the other way around, that like a website or a company is implanting thoughts in your mind and making you behave in a certain way. So always, if that could be taken care of, that you are initiating that connection every time, I think that that should be, like, from a framework point of view, that should be the.
I
Okay, so
think
that's
that
what
sure, go ahead, Surya.
that's what I was asking. Like, where does AI seek human permission? Uh, like, let's say I am to let's say I'm busy in my work and I'm dependent on AI for, let's say, my taking care of my grocery list, buying, or those things. Uh, my AI knows that I have a certain things that I have on a weekly basis. Let's say I need fruit juices, some cereal on a daily or on a regular basis. But the point of human intervention is, will it should it add things by itself on this list?
I think that the point of human intervention is to prevent something that the AI can do on its own. So I think every individual has its own limitations, has its own boundary, and everyone does not want AI to interfere with his or her own boundaries. So I think setting boundaries for an AI is very important for companies. For example, if there is a fire in a house, I want my fire alarm to like sound an alarm, but at the same time when I'm cooking, I don't want the fire alarm to sound. So having these kind of boundaries for a particular individual is something that should be customizable for everyone. And I think this also requires trust. For example, as Anurag mentioned, in the level 0 to level 5 automation, I think in the initial phases, automation can be less, wherein we are in the pilot seat and we see what the AI is doing. And over the time, if we have trust on that AI, we think that the AI is giving us better result at the task that we want to achieve. We can give it more autonomy. So having this customizable setting of how much we want AI to interfere with our decisions is something that should be common to most of the AI systems, if not all, is what I think.
Okay, so there should be a lever that can be pulled when things go
Correct.
awry, right?
Correct. And
Okay, okay.
every individual should be the owner of that lever, right?
Yeah.
My level of personal comfort or personal boundaries might not match yours. So I should be able to customize my reliance on AI, and you should be able to customize your reliance on AI as well.
Yeah, that's a good
So,
point. Thank you for visiting the PBNJ podcast. We will be bringing to you such content on a weekly basis. This week was AI. Tune in for some different range of topics on our weekly show at the PBNJ podcast.